Welcome to Two Trees in the Garden of Eden Bible Ministry. A lot of our Bible study students have questions, and I thought it's better for me to answer the questions online than to answer each person individually, because a lot of the questions are the same for many of the students. So that means I'm repeating answers all the time to various different students as they progress on the Bible study journey. So we received a question from one of the Bible study students at Two Trees. She's been a long time student. Her name is Duifie. Her question is in Afrikaans. We have to do these Bible study questions and answers in English for the sake of all the people that cannot understand Afrikaans. So I'm just going to play her message and then I will translate it into English.
Hallo Mada. Ekskuus tog, ek het 'n vraag om vir jou te vra. Ons sit nou die Bybel hier en lees en ons is nou hier by die afstammelinge van Herewith, Ham en Sem in hoofstuk 10. Ek het die 1953 vertaling van die Afrikaanse Bybel. Dan sê hy nou hier uit hulle het verdeel geraak die kuslande van die nasies in hulle lande, elkeen na sy taal.
So I'm not going to play the whole question. Davey's question has to do with Genesis 10. So today, questions and answers, we're going to discuss this question of Davey in Genesis 10. And her question is the following. She reads in Genesis 10 verse 31. These are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. And these are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. The sons of Noah, of course, ne? Then in the next chapter, she reads that the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So we are going to look at her first question, which is, how can there be different tongues, different languages in Genesis 10, but now suddenly in Genesis 11 it says the whole earth was of one language? So it's indeed a very good question. Let's start with Genesis 10 verse 1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were born the sons of men after the flood. So in studying the book of Genesis with Two Trees in the Garden of Eden, we actually do go into detail about the 70 nations. Because if you read the whole Genesis 10, you'll see the whole genealogy, and you count them all together and you get 70 people that are mentioned. And out of them comes the 70 nations, the nations or the 70 as it's called. And you can find this in any dictionary, encyclopedias, ancient historical text. There's this notion of the 70 nations from the book of Genesis. And then all through the Bible, there's various places where it talks about 70, especially when it comes to the Feast of Tabernacles. Then 70 bulls are offered. And that basically comes down to the fact that Israel offered a bull for each one of the 70 nations on earth, just to show you how God thinks about everybody and how he wants everybody to become part of his nation, of his people. But there's 70 nations upon the earth. It's a conception based on the list of the descendants of Noah, as you find them in Genesis 10. And it's called the Table of Nations. According to this table, all the nations of the earth may be classified as descended from one or another of Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The principle behind the classification is generally geographic proximity rather than ethnic or linguistic connection. So that means in the encyclopedia, it had to do with where they lived. It didn't really have to do with skin color or race or ethnic division yet. All right. These nations descended from Japheth were Gomer, and Medai and Javan and Ashkenaz and Elijah and Kittim, and so you can go on and on and on. The lands occupied by the Japhetites bordered the Fertile Crescent in the north and penetrated. So you can read that whole history. There's a lot of opinions as to who exactly all these nations were, what their names were, and where they lived. But at the end of the day, all this culminated into the dispersion of the 70 descendants out of the 3 sons of Noah. Now, I want to read for you from the art scroll. The art scroll of Genesis. Not going into too much detail, but a lot of ancient biblical topical research has to be done from ancient books and from people that understand the ancient cultures, the nationalities, the geographic, the language. We can't just read Bible verses and then make up our own minds. So, this specific book on page 332. So, when we look at Genesis 10, and then specifically the verses of 32, from these the nations spread forth over the earth after the flood. But they did not spread forth until after the Tower of Babel, which we call the dispersion. So God dispersed all the nations, all the people that gathered together around the Tower of Babel, that was busy building it. That's all in Genesis 11. We'll get to that now. So when we read Genesis 10, because remember that the Bible doesn't really bother a huge amount on sequence. Sometimes things will happen in sequence. Sometimes things will happen together, not necessarily the one, then the other, then the other. But the Bible will describe one, then the other, then the other, although it happened in the same time period. So the nations did not spread forth until after the dispersion. The phrase after the flood reverts to the beginning of the verse. Explain the verse, therefore, this way. Rather read it this way. These are the families of Noah's descendants that were born after the flood, who later spread forth over the earth after the dispersion. From these the nations spread forth, even those who did not become separate nations, nevertheless were dispersed to many places until the entire world was settled. So Genesis 10 verse 5, Genesis 10 verse 20, and Genesis 10 verse 31 describes for each one of the sons of Noah the very same dispersion, what happened with them after the dispersion, but also how they were seen at that stage, dividing into the areas. So Genesis 10 verse 5, these are the sons of Japheth. By these sons were the isles of the Gentiles divided into their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families in their nations. The same is said for the sons of Ham in verse 20. These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. And then verse 31, these are the sons of Shem, after their families, their tongues, their lands, and their nations. So it's not like each of Shem, Ham, and Japheth's sons or grandsons now went into different directions, each with their own language and family and nations. No, their dispersion into languages, families, and nations happened in chapter 11 after the Tower of Babel, because the same people that is talked about in chapter 10 are still the same people, all the sons and grandsons and great-great-great-grandsons that's part of Noah's descendants. They're all in this one area. We'll see that now. I'll show you now. So they're all in this one area. And now what happens in chapter 10, one thing is described. After the dispersion of chapter 11, this is where all the different people, all the sons with their families went. And this became their languages and their geographical areas where they went. But just to give the genealogy is what happens in 10. So it's not like the people were dispersed in chapter 10 and there were different languages. And now in chapter 11, there's suddenly one language, and now they were dispersed again. It's the same dispersion. It's the same scattering of the families, the nations, and the languages, as what chapter 10 talks about. Chapter 11 just tells you what happened after that, after the time of Noah's 3 sons and their great-grandsons, and eventually Nimrod came to be. And then they built the Tower of Babel, and then God dispersed them from there. But who was it that he dispersed? It was all these families talked about in chapter 10. All right. So Moses explained, because Moses wrote the book of Genesis. So Moses explained one thing until he was finished explaining that. And then he explained another thing. It's very similar to the book of Revelation. A lot of the stuff in Revelation seems to happen in sequence because they were explained in consecutive chapters in the Bible. Right? But in various cases, many of these things actually happen simultaneously, or happen in the same period, or happen while the other one is happening. But it's explained in different chapters, because how do you mix all of this? You'll become confused. So Genesis 11 verse 1 now says, the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. They spoke Hebrew, just like their forefathers. Their forefathers learned Hebrew from their forefathers, and they learned it from Adam, all the way back in the Garden of Eden, because Adam spoke Hebrew, which he learned again from God, because God created everything in Hebrew. Hebrew is the perfect, most beautiful, most powerful language on earth. It's the only language where you can talk for hours about one verse, and then break that verse up in words, and then you can talk for hours about each and every word. And then you can take each and every word and you can break it up in the individual letters. And you can talk for hours about the meaning of that letters, how it concludes into the meaning of the words, and how that makes a whole new understanding of that verse. Hebrew is the only language where you can do that. So that is why me and thousands of other people believe that Hebrew was the only original language. I mean, for heaven's sakes, it's quite logical. The whole Tanakh, the whole Old Testament, is available in Hebrew today. We believe the New Testament was written in Hebrew, later on translated into Greek, and the Hebrew scrolls were burnt. There's long history regarding that, but nevertheless. So the one language everybody spoke was Hebrew. The whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Verse 2. Okay, we'll get to verse 2 now, because that's the next question that Duifie had. But so the one language was Hebrew, and then after the Tower of Babel, God dispersed into 70 nations, into 70 languages, all the people that came together to build the Tower of Babel. And now out of the line of Shem, we eventually have Abraham. You've got the line of Ham, and then eventually you've got Nimrod. And you've got all the enemies of God coming from the line of Ham, which is the brother of Shem. Shem is the messianic genealogy. Ham is the cursed genealogy. Out of him and his wife, who probably had the Nephilim seed inside of her, came all the Nephilim nations, the giants and all the Canaanites, all the Mitzrahites, the Egyptians, and all the people from Cush and Put, all those lands and peoples and nations that was always against God, that had this hatred for God and for Israel. So Duifie's next question has to do with Genesis 11 verse 2.
Dan sê vers 2 van hoofstuk 11, en toe hulle wegtrek na die ooste, vind hulle 'n laagte in die land Sinaar, en daar het hulle gaan woon. Wie's hulle?
Alright, so Genesis 11 verse 2, and it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. So Duifie wants to know, who are these people now? Because chapter 10 just said that these are the families of Noah, of the sons of Noah, and they all went into their different directions. Okay, so now she's wondering, who are these people of Genesis 11 verse 2? Hopefully, if you followed this far, you'll realize it's the same people. It's the same generations and sons of Genesis 10. Alright, so it came to pass as they journeyed from the east. So, do you remember where Abraham was from? Abraham, Genesis 15 verse 7, God said to him, I'm Yahuwah your Elohim, that brought you out from Ur, the land of the Chaldeans. Now, the land of the Chaldeans, if you can Google, go to Google Maps or go look for Ur, the land of the Chaldeans, and find it on a map. And you'll see that it's where modern day Iraq is. So here you've got the map, here you've got Israel, here you've got Iraq and Syria and Turkey and, you know, all those countries. So Shinar is a valley. When you move from Ur and you move in a northwestern direction towards Syria, and if you go more west, you'll get to Israel. So out of Ur, you go northwest, you pass Babylon, and you go further, and then you're going to get to Syria. But if you turn in a westerly direction and you go further, you get to Jerusalem, you get to Israel. So Ur is just south of Babylon, and that's where Nimrod, of course, was ruling from during the days after the flood. So nobody knows for sure where Mount Ararat is, because remember, Noah and the ark landed on Mount Ararat. A lot of people think it must be in the Turkey, Syria area, but nobody knows for sure. But it was definitely in that Middle East area, because that's where everybody lived. All the descendants of Noah was in the Turkey, Syria, Chaldea, the Chaldean area. Today we call it the Middle East, the part where most of the descendants of Ishmael is living in. So, but from Mount Ararat, from this area in Turkey and Syria, they spread out, Noah and his sons. They landed there at Mount Ararat, and from there on, they spread into that whole Middle East Turkish area, in the whole Chaldean area. So they spread over, as you can see in chapter 10. If you look at all the areas mentioned in chapter 10, you'll see that it's a lot of them are in that area. They lived among that area. So remember, the sons of Noah multiplied. Each of Noah's sons had various sons, and they had sons, and they intermarried with each other, the nephews and the nieces, and so there was a lot of people. So Genesis 9 verse 1, God said to Noah and his sons, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. But they did not spread out far. They didn't replenish the whole earth. They kind of stayed together, and that's a big problem for God. God said, go out, replenish the whole earth. But they clucked together in the same area. And eventually they had a king over them, Nimrod. And eventually he wanted to have ultimate power. And they wanted to build the Tower of Babel. There's various things we discussed in the 2 Trees Genesis Bible studies regarding that. That's the beginning of the whole pagan sun god worship system, where they have one global government, one global control. God said, no, that's not what I wanted. I wanted you to spread out. You didn't listen to me. So let's continue. God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said, multiply, replenish the earth, but they didn't spread out. They stayed close to one another. And as you can see, by the time of Abraham, he was living in Chaldea, in the land of Ur. But he learned about Yahuwah from Shem. So, unfortunately, the Yasher has been taken out of our Bibles by the Roman Catholic Church. But Yasher is mentioned in the Bible. Therefore, I read the book of Yasher. And Yasher explains exactly where Abram heard about Yahuwah. He learned from Shem. So, Genesis 11 verse 11. Shem lived after he begat Arphaxad 500 years. So, Shem was, after he had his firstborn son, he lived another 500 years. And he begat many sons of daughters. So, Abraham was Shem's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson. Abraham went to learn about Yahuwah from Shem, because Shem was still alive. So from Mount Ararat, this huge family of Noah grew and lived all over the Turkish Syria area. And after a couple of generations, another great-great-great-great-grandson of Noah, namely Nimrod, started again with the deep mystery of the occult of the fallen angels. And I say again because that is who reigned in Genesis 6 before the flood. So Nimrod started again with all that. And he rules Babylon with paganism. And now he wanted to make war against God. Where do I get that information from? The book of Enoch, also mentioned in the Bible, also removed by the Roman Catholic Church. So remember now, Israel is west from the land of Ur, the Chaldean area. Between Israel and Ur, you get the Shinar Valley, the Shinar Peninsula. So when you travel in a westerly direction from Ur to Israel, you travel in a westerly direction, it means you are coming from the east. You with me? Remember Adrekskunde, Geographic, when we did high school. If you go towards the west, you are coming from the east. Remember now. Looking at the ancient map of Babylon, we will see then that Nimrod was traveling from the Babylonian area, his capital city. Now remember, the capital city was a little bit overcrowded. He wanted to build this huge tower. He needed flat earth. Haha, flat earth. He was traveling towards the west, coming from the east. So he was traveling west, coming from the east. Genesis 11:2, this is now Duifie's question. As they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and there they dwelt. So as you journey from the east, leaving the overcrowded area of Babylon, Nimrod and all his guys came to a plain, a peninsula, an open land where they could then build the Tower of Babel. And this was the ideal geographical location for Nimrod. So he decided to build the tower there. But they were all still speaking Hebrew at this stage. It's all still the same families, the same generation, the same genealogy of chapter 10. During this time, the people started worshipping Nimrod and other pagan sun gods under Nimrod's authority, and they wanted to make war against their god. They didn't want to listen to Shem. They all one big happy family, and they basically at that stage had one religion, and that was paganism, sun god paganism, except Shem. Shem was still alive at that stage. But nobody wanted to listen to Shem. Shem was 500 years old. Nobody wanted to listen to him. Nobody cared about Yahuwah. And that's why they followed Nimrod. Remember, he was a great and mighty warrior. He probably looked like Superman, some Nephilim hybrid, genetically modified thing. But anyway, so the whole earth at that stage was under Nimrod. And nobody wanted to listen to an old, boring man with talks about judgment and Torah and obedience and the flood. Nobody was interested in that anymore. So, except Abraham. Loving, loving, loving Abraham. We are the children, the seed of Abraham, because we feel the same in this world currently, where Nimrod, the sun god, one world religion, one world government is in control. Nevertheless, so I'm hoping that I answered the question. So there was one language. After the Tower of Babel, God dispersed everybody into 70 areas, 70 nations, 70 languages. And chapter 10 and chapter 11 is not necessarily consecutive. It happened at the same time. The two chapters must be read together to understand what historically God is trying to teach us. We have some more questions, and we'll handle that in the next session.